餐的话，也请大家赶快把它吃完之后，就做我们即将要开始了。
非常欢迎大家参加今天的研讨会。那我们今天的研讨会呢，其实主要要谈的就是我们北欧关于无关过失的 system。那他们有一个很特别的 system， 就是关于 no brand 的 system。那因为目前在我们国内整个医疗制度诉讼的情况，造成医病关系冲突的很厉害。那经过他们这个 system 的运作，发现说，可以降低他们的诉讼的机会，而且可以提高他们水准。所以今天很荣幸，就是特地邀请了2位外宾来参加演讲。那首先我们先请李院长先来为我们说几句话。
Mr. Person from Sweden, Professor Hoff from Denmark, and my dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure and honor, and on behalf of the colleagues of National Technical University, NCTUH, I welcome all of you to attend this meeting. And first, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to Mr. Esperson. He is the senior legal advisor of the Swedish Patient Insurance Association, and Professor Huff is a professor of anesthesiology from Denmark. And I would like to invite you to attend this meeting. And I spent one whole day from 9 to 7 2 days ago to stay with Mr. Esperson and Professor Huff and to listen their speeches. I personally learned a lot from this discussion, and I personally think that no-brain compensation system in Sweden and in Denmark may be a good system, and it may ease the tension between patient and physicians, and may improve the patient safety, and may improve the quality of care. And today we have many medical students, residents, and surgical faculty and medical faculty here, and we also have friends from Institute of Law. Or we have prosecutors here, and we have judges here. And so today we have medical and law professionals here, and to listen this most important people coming from abroad. I hope every one of us can enjoy, and probably we can learn a lot from their speech. And finally, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to Dr. Yen. Would you please stand up, and his daughter. Because through their effort, and I would like also extend my sincere to Dr. Zhang. 他是我们急诊部的医生 ，and Professor Li Bodang. He will chair this meeting today. And another we have Xu Shujun. Where are you? Xu Shujun and Jiang Zanyu. Oh, they are still working outside. And I hope every one of us can learn a lot from this meeting. I hope you can enjoy the speech. Thank you for coming here. Thank you. Because there, I think some people will leave before 9 because we have our patient clinic from the 9 o'clock. So if they leave, so don't mind, okay?
谢谢李院长。 那现在呢，我们再欢迎另外联齐和院长也帮我们说几句话，谢谢。
Hello, Mr. Edson, our Superintendent Lee, Dr. Ye, the Director Lee, and President of Congress, my dear colleagues and students. On behalf of my colleagues and students at our College of Medicine, NCKU, I'd like to thank all the guests for coming today for this forum. As you can see here, the topics of this forum is the wheel of future. I think that we all want to have a bright future, and even though in our system of practicing the medicine, we always looking forward to better care of our patients. However, since true error is human, and we have to face it and do something about it. I still remember our deputy superintendent, now is the current dean of the college management, Dr. Zhang Yuhen. When he was deputy superintendent of our hospital, he mentioned about sigma. There is must be less than 1 per 1 million error in air traffic. In order to set their passengers and the airlines, that the pilot or the air controllers had to do route analysis to try to find out the error committed in the air traffic crash. And for the same reason, since we have to save more patients, and I think it will be a win-win situation if we can face and do something about the error we have to commit. I have been to Taipei 2 days ago, attended the forum. I'm sure today's Mr. Epperson and Dr. Hope's experience in Denmark and Sweden will shed light on what we can do and learn from their systems. Particularly want to thank Dr. Ye for organizing this wonderful symposium. I have heard that yesterday they have already reached a consensus among all different parties. I'm looking forward that in the future, in Taiwan, we're going to have a better system so that our patients and the community and our healthcare can all win the future. Thank you very much.
First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Ye for taking me here to Taiwan. We have had
因为我们院长就是等一下我们讲要看，所以先制赠一些小礼物给我们的来宾。 pleasure to introduce our first speaker, this person, and the topic will be focused on the Swedish Patient Injury Act. We will understand how the system work, and let's give a big hand to Mr. S. Person.
Yes, like I said when I started before here, that I first of all want to thank Dr. Ye for taking me here to Taiwan. It's a wonderful time, and Dr. Hove and I, we have had 4 very nice and intensive, to say the least, days in Taipei. And when we were there, we understood that it's not always so easy to be a doctor in Taiwan. We have long work hours, sometimes understaffed clinics, but also very much that you could be afraid of going to criminal court, and that has astonished us coming from Nordic countries, where we don't have this plain culture that you have here in Taiwan. When you have an person that went here, it looks like even if the doctor hasn't done anything wrong and it's an avoidable injury, they want to have a scapegoat and they want to hang somebody. Somebody has to be responsible. So I guess that's why we are here today, to tell about how the situation is in the Nordic countries. In Sweden we have a new blame, patient insurance, and the idea behind it is that doing mistakes is part of human nature, that one has to learn from the mistakes. And we think that you could do that much better in a no-blame environment, where you can have no-blame reporting without being afraid of legal actions. And also looking for a scapegoat is a very efficient way of killing more patients. It increases the risk for not reporting the mistakes and for cover-up. In Sweden, we had the same situation as you have today here in Taiwan today, before 1975. At that time, patients that wanted to have compensation for treatment injuries, they had to prove negligence, error, or omission. And that was mostly very difficult for people without any medical knowledge. And it was also difficult for them to get medical witnesses that could help them. And it was time consuming. It could take, if you went to court in Sweden, it could take between 2 to 4 years. And it was also a costly process. Because in Sweden, if a patient sued the doctor and lost the case, he had to pay his own lawyers, but also the lawyers of the doctor. And that could be very costly, up to perhaps $27,000 US if you lost. And it was only in about 100 cases per year where the patient received some kind of compensation. So then in the 1960s, 1970s, at that time, Sweden had a very good economic situation, and therefore they thought that we should have a better situation for patients that were injured. So we had a lot of motions in the Swedish parliament to have a special law for patient injury compensation. But there was nowhere in the world where you had a special compensation system. So instead so it was considered technically too difficult, but instead the county councils that in Sweden stand for 90% of the healthcare, so 90% of the healthcare in Sweden is public, they thought that they could perhaps instead have a voluntary scheme. So together with the big insurance companies in Sweden and the Ministry of Social Affairs, and Justice, Ministry of Justice, we got a voluntary patient insurance scheme from 1975. And the insurance scheme in Sweden is paid by the healthcare providers, the hospitals then, not the doctors, and it's taken care of by the insurance companies in Sweden. And from this time on, from 1975 and on, the compensation is paid on objective grounds. We are not looking for faults, negligence anymore. We talk about avoidable or unavoidable injuries. And I will come back to that later on. And with this scheme in Sweden, what took many years before going to court now takes only a few months. And it's also free of charge. It's very simple for a patient if he wants to make a claim. You have notification of the claims in every hospital. So the only thing the patient really has to do is to say that after this hip operation, I had an infection or a nerve injury. And then he gives this form to the hospital, they send it to the insurance company, and the insurance company take in all journals, all medical information, and then there is a lawyer together with a medical advisor at the insurance companies that make the investigation. So it doesn't cost the patient anything, and he gets a neutral, objective investigation of his case. And today we have around 6,000 patients that are compensated each year in Sweden. And if you compare that with Taiwan today, that would be about 15,000 people that were compensated. I said that in the beginning it was a voluntary scheme, but when we have had this scheme for 22 years, we thought it worked very well. And both doctors and patients were very happy. So then, instead of a voluntary scheme, we got legislation in this area. So we got a Patient Injury Act, because that means the coverage for the voluntary scheme was 99%. But the only way to guarantee that everybody is covered is that you have legislation. So that was the reason why we went from a voluntary scheme to legislation. And later on, we got the same system in all the Nordic countries, Finland, Norway, and Denmark. And one thing that is very important with the no-blame system is that they have a big wall, a big, thick, high Chinese wall between compensation system and the disciplinary system. In Sweden, you could still, if you want to, if you are a patient, go to criminal court, perhaps one case a year in Sweden. And you could also have civil litigation, but that's also very rare, because in the court you can never get any more money than you get from the patient insurance. So there is really no reason to go to civil court. But you still have that chance, and you could also have disciplinary action against the doctor. So the patient insurance is really a supplement to what we had before. And we think that it's very important, and if it should work, that all the information we have in the patient insurance scheme stays there and don't automatically go over to the authorities, because in this way the doctors feel free to help the patient to make a claim. But if they know that the authorities will get all this information too, they might be not so willing to help the patients. So this, we think, is very important. But of course, if the patient thinks so, which very few patients in Sweden think, you could still go to court if you would like to. So this Swedish insurance scheme has helped many more patients than before to get compensation. But one thing that is also very important is that this has also created confidence, trust, and openness between the personnel and the patient. So we estimate that in 60 to 80% of the cases, the physician, a nurse, or a legal social worker has helped the patient to report the matter. And this also gives the patient a feeling of redress. We have found out that there are 3 things that the patient really wants. And if something goes wrong, the patient wants the doctor or the hospital to say, there has been an injury and we are very sorry for that, excuse us. That is very important for patients. Also compensation, and also most patients say that we don't want this to happen to another patient in the future. And we think all of these things, making an apology, paying out compensation, and preventive work will function best in a no-blame system where doctors won't have to be afraid for going to a criminal court. In Sweden, if a patient is not satisfied with the health care, he has 3 choices. First, in every county in Sweden, in every region, you have an independent patient advisory committee, and they solve problems, everyday problems, like the patient thinks, why did I have to wait so long for an operation? Why didn't the doctor take an X-ray? Or, more everyday. And then the personnel from this committee takes the patient and the doctor and put them together so they can sit down and quietly the doctor can describe for the patient what kind of sickness he has, what kind of treatment he can have, and try to explain everything. And this usually works out very well. And if the patient wants to have compensation, well then he can come to us and from the patient insurance scheme get compensation. And we have just now in Sweden, when it comes to disciplinary action, we have a totally new system from the 1st of January this year. But up till 2011, a patient could start disciplinary actions against doctors. They could go down to the Health and Medical Care Liability Board, and they had about 4,500 claims every year. And in around 400 cases, the doctor got a warning that he had not done things according to scientific knowledge. But now we got the Patient Safety Act from the 1st of January this year. And the reason we got this act was that we wanted in Sweden to change focus from doctors and nurses to the healthcare providers, to the hospitals. Before 2011, the authorities almost only investigated the doctors if they had been negligent, and very seldom the healthcare provider. And the doctor, he could get a warning, and as we saw before, they got it in 10% of the cases, but then nothing really happened. The doctor just worked on, and the healthcare provider, the hospital, said, we have done nothing wrong, it was the doctor, so why should we change anything? The doctor has to change. But from this year, the focus in Sweden is more on the role of the healthcare provider system and processes, and not individuals. And so the healthcare provider, the hospitals in Sweden now, much more than before, have to work systematically with patient safety, which means work with prevention and investigating adverse events, inform patients when an adverse event has happened, and the healthcare provider has to have a plan what to do to prevent adverse events happening in the future. And to increase the patient safety by more incident reports, the disciplinary actions that we had before in Sweden, warnings to doctors, has been taken away. And this is so we could have a better blame-free reporting system. And instead of warnings, the doctors much easier than before can be put under surveillance for up to 3 years. And you have to have a plan for that period. And if the doctor doesn't follow that, then they can take his license. But that is mostly when a doctor showed serious incompetence. So this is this new Safety Act in Sweden was to make it easy to work with prevention. Well, in Sweden, it's insurance companies that takes care of the investigation. And then you could ask yourself, is that more efficient? Is that better than court taking care of cases? Yes, we think so. Because we have low cost per case for claims handling, short time for handling, and no economic risk for patients, so they dare to make a claim. The legal costs. If a patient make a claim to an insurance company, the cost is for handling the case as such is around $1,100 US. And if the patient is not satisfied with that, he can go to a national board and have his case investigated there. And that's where I work as a legal advisor. And that costs around, for each claim, around $1,200 US. But if the patient wants to go to court, then it's much more expensive. Just the cost for the lawyers is at average around $27,000 US. And then of course also you have the cost for the court as such. The time for settlement, before it took 2 to 4 years to settle a case. Now it's in 50% of the cases the patient gets a decision within 6 months. And then you can say 80% within 12 months. But just the day before I left for Taiwan, I heard that now the patient gets the result in 70% within 6 months. So it's much faster. Talking about compensation and why we in Sweden can afford it, because it's only the Nordic countries that have patient insurance. It's very important to understand that the patient insurance in Sweden is subsidiary to the general welfare system we have. So if a person is sick, he cannot work because of a car accident, patient injury, work injury, or whatever. He always, from the welfare system in Sweden, get 80% of his loss of income compensated. And if he cannot work anymore and he's disabled, he will get 64% of his salary from the welfare system. And patient insurance just have to come on top of that. That means it's not so expensive as, for example, in the United States, where the insurance company has to pay from the first crown. And also costs in Sweden are very low. You could say the healthcare for Swedes it's not free, but almost free. So if a person goes to a doctor every day and he gets a lot of pharmaceuticals and so on, the cost for a whole year should never be more than $350 US. And if a patient goes to hospital, even if he has very advanced surgery and so on, he never pays more than $15 a day. So when it comes to loss of income and cost, much of that is already paid by the welfare system. in Sweden, the main rule for compensation in Sweden is that we pay out compensation for avoidable injuries. But those injuries that with the knowledge we have today and with the technique cannot be avoided, they are not compensated. So you could say that you have three different systems. One is the one you have in Taiwan today, where you have negligence. Then we have what we in the Nordic countries call a new blame system. And then you can go even further and have a no-fault system where you pay compensation for everything. They had that in the 70s and 80s in New Zealand, and it broke down because it became too expensive. So I think that if you should change in Taiwan, one should not go all the way, because that will be very expensive. It will break down the system, and then patients will be very unsatisfied. So I think the solution we have in Sweden, and to many parts it's not totally, it's the same in Denmark. So the criteria for compensation, the main criteria is, was injury avoidable or not? And here you could see how we look upon it, that we say that compensation is paid if the injury is caused by medical treatment, provided that the injury could have been avoided, either by a different performance of the chosen procedure or by choosing some other available procedure, which according to an assessment made retroactively, made from a medical point of view, would have satisfied the need for treatment in a less risky way. This I could talk about for many days, because it's of course a little bit complicated. But we have, if you are interested in what cases we think are where the injury is avoidable and where it's not, you can go in on the internet, and I will show you where you can see. There we have many different cases and it's in English, and there you could sit down and see, because it's very difficult here in just a few minutes to say what's avoidable or not. But it has worked rather well. And the assessment whether the injury could have been avoided under the circumstances that existed is done after the fact. So that means if you have an injury during operation, it's afterwards when you have all the facts that you make the assessments. And perhaps you had an surgery and you have had a nerve injury, and the nerve was in an area where it usually is not. But had the surgeon known about it, he could have avoided the injury. And the standard of care used in the assessment is that of an experienced specialist in the field concerned. So we are not so interested in who did it, but we are interested in why it happened. So then we always, so if it's an orthopedic surgery, it was perhaps a young doctor, there was many complications. He did as well as he could, but there was still an injury. Then we ask ourselves, if the chief surgeon had done the same operation, would it have been possible to avoid the injury? And if you say yes, an experienced doctor, he would have avoided the injury, well, then we can pay out compensation. But if we say that even the best of doctors, this could happen because this is outside the control of the surgeon, then it's not compensated according to the Swedish scheme. And we say that the rarity and severity of the injury is not considered in this assessment. The crucial question is whether the injury could have been avoided or not. Here we have a little difference with the Danish system, and you will hear more about that soon. In Sweden, if a patient has a patient injury, and we have 6,000 cases each year, what can we compensate in this system? And first of all, we pay out compensation for economic losses. like loss of income, additional expenses. And here the rule is that the patient should always be compensated at 100% for loss of income and all expenses. But as you heard before, much of it is already paid by the welfare system in Sweden. And then we have non-economic losses for pain and suffering, permanent disability, and so on. And that is not paid by the welfare system. And here, it depends how severe the injury is. So we could pay in Sweden something between $1 up to 250,000 US dollar for non-economic losses. And in the event of death, we pay funeral expenses, we pay loss of support. So if the breadwinner in the family has died, then we pay the rest of the family loss of support. And also we can pay what we call special contribution to next of kin. So if somebody dies, they can get some compensation for pain and suffering for what has happened to the father or mother or child. So in Sweden, it's the insurance companies, they take care of the administration. And if you're not satisfied with their decision, you can go to a national patient claims panel. And as I said before, that's where I'm working. And in this panel, you have lawyers, legal people, you have doctors, you have members of the Swedish Parliament that should watch out for patients' rights. And then still, if the patient is still not satisfied, he actually can go to court. But that happens very seldom, as I will show you here. In Sweden, we have 9 million inhabitants, a little more, around 9 million. And we have 12,000 claims, and 6,000 are accepted. The most common reason why that many claims are not compensated is because there is no treatment injury. It's effects of their basic illness that the patient have claimed compensation for. So there is no causal relation between what they have, the injury that they have claimed and the health care. So it's in the insurance companies then, 12,000 claims, 6,000 accepted, and then around 1,100 of these cases come to the claims panel, and we make another decision than the insurance companies in around 10%. And then the patient still has the right to go to court in Sweden, but as you see, it's very few cases, 10 court cases here. It's one. I don't think that we ever had more than one case that was accepted by a Swedish court here. So you see, out of 12,000 claims in Sweden, only one goes to court and wins. So it's another situation than you have here. It might be interesting to know where we have most treatment injuries in Sweden. And of course they are in areas where you have surgery. And so the most common claims they have to do with orthopedic surgery. It's 21% of the claims, and here we have 23% of the costs. General surgery, 15% of the claims, 30% of the cost. And then it's very interesting here because then we come to obstetrics, gynecology. It's 8% of the claims, but it's 25% of the cost. And why is it like that? I will soon come back to that. And then we have also dental clinics have quite many claims, but tooth injuries are mostly not so expensive. But why do we have so many, why are they so expensive when you come to obstetrics and gynecology? Well, here we have the brain damaged children. That's the biggest problem in this area all over the world. especially in America, they have big problems with these injuries. In Sweden, we have about 100 infants born every year in Sweden. And I think actually the Swedish healthcare, when it comes to delivery, is one of have the best figures in the world. Still, we have around 30 claims every year for financial compensation due to birth-related brain injuries. And around 12 of these cases have been looked upon as avoidable brain injuries. And they are very expensive. As you can see here, the compensation for these 12 avoidable brain injuries is around 20% of the total compensation from the patient insurance. And we have altogether 6,000 compensated injuries every year. So most of these children, they die rather early, but if they live for a longer time, they will be extremely expensive, these injuries. And the reason for the brain injuries were that CTE interpretation was not right, and the doctors was not acting timely on abnormal CTE, and then it was also the scene prescription was not done in the right way, non-optimal mode for delivery, and the rules was not followed when it comes to resuscitations. And here it's important to say that the new blame system is very good for prevention, and here a Swedish doctor, she made her doctoral thesis on brain damaged children, and then she could go to the patient insurance scheme, and she looked on all the cases we had in Sweden between 1990 and 2005. For 15 years, it was around 500 cases. And then she had very good material. She had all the journals, all the facts. So she wrote down in her thesis what should be done to avoid many of these injuries. And that is now standard in all Swedish hospitals from 1 year ago, I think it was. So here you could see that the patient insurance scheme can give back to the healthcare good information how to prevent injuries in the future. Do we have any weaknesses in the Swedish system? We think it has been working very well. Patients are satisfied. Doctors in Sweden are satisfied. Our politicians are satisfied. Media doesn't write anything more about it. So actually it's functioning very well. But of course, the avoidability criteria is difficult in the beginning. So it takes some time. It works very well now. We have good case law and guidelines what is avoidable and not. But in the beginning, it can be a little bit tricky. And then also that injuries due to, here we have the question of informed consent. It's not covered by the Patient Injury Act. And the reason for that is that many times we just look on papers in our scheme, but in the court they can ask the doctor what did you inform about, and also the patient. And this question of informed consent is tricky in many ways, and then they have said that it's better that the court looks into those cases. And what are the advantages of the no blame scheme? Well, it's easier to get compensation. Many more patients than before are compensated. Compensation is on objective grounds. Rule of evidence is more liberal in the system. Procedure is free of charge. There is no economic risk for the patient. Short time for claims handling. Low administration costs. And no blame for doctors. No fear for reporting, and claims can therefore be used for learning. And it's also easier to do root cause analysis and find failure in routines and systems rather than individual failure. and also, which is very important, much better relation between personnel and patients. I would just like to end here and compare, give you some figures, hard figures, so you can compare the no-fault system to the system which the rest of the world have. If all countries would have the same population, like 10 million, then the figures would look like this. But, you know, Sweden, we have around 9, Spain over 40 million. But if we had the same population, Sweden and Denmark would have around 3,000 compensated patients that are inpatient. Some of the figures here are a little bit different, but that's inpatients. They would have around 3,000 inpatients per year compensated from our schemes. And then you could see other countries like the Netherlands, that is usually very close to Sweden, it's 500 cases. France, 300, Spain, 100. Sweden and Denmark, we have no blame systems. And the rest of the countries here, they have a tort system where you're looking for negligence. So here, with hard figures, you can see it's much easier in the Nordic countries to get compensation than other countries. You could watch here and see Sweden, 3,000 cases compensated, and Canada, 175. And then you could look at the next picture here. Cost per claim per inhabitant a year. And here you see it costs every Swede around 10 US dollar, this scheme in Sweden. And in Canada, it almost costs the same. It costs 9 US dollars per year. But Sweden, we had 3,000 cases compensated. Canada only had 175. So how can that come? There are many explanations for that, but one of those you could see in my last picture here. Who gets the money? Who gets the money from premiums? Well, in the United States and Canada, lawyers and insurance companies take around 70% of the money in the system, and the patient only gets about 30%. So if you pay out $1 in the United States, it costs $2, not very efficient. And in Sweden, the administration of the scheme takes around a little less than 20% of the money, and the rest goes to the patient. And that's where we think it should go. So that's what I would like to say about the Swedish scheme. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Esperson's speech, and very impressed system and very clear presentation. 其实从他们这个制度，因为我怕我讲英文大家听不懂，所以还是讲中文。因为从这个制度呢，我们可以知道说，他们国家他们最特别的地方就是他们有成立一个 insurance 一个保险。那如果说病人呢有发生伤害的时候呢，他们就可以对这个 insurance 提出申请，那他们是不是可以理赔？那他们理赔的标准跟我们最大不同就是，如果这个伤害呢被认定说这个是可以避免的，那他们就会理赔。那至于说医生有没有过失，其实并不是在这里面去讨论的事情。那因为如果说病人的那个就是问题都可以得到赔偿的话，那其实病人很少会去提诉讼。那另外一个最大原因就是他们没有提起诉讼，原因就是因为其实他们在这个保险制度里面得到赔偿，跟法院最后赔偿会就是判赔的金额其实差不多的。那他如果说去提起诉讼的话，他未必真的能够打赢。另外一个问题就是他们必须要负担一个风险，就是他们必须付自己的律师费跟对方医师的律师费，如果他们打诉的话。所以基本上在这样制度设计之下，在这个国家里面，他就很少就是最后医师真的会被以提告的方式去做诉讼的解决。那另外一个问题就是说，我们也可以很诚实的去面对说，如果发生出错的时候，我们可以面对 我们的错误到底在哪里？那再经过一个 system 去整合这一些错误，那能够找出对整个制度去做改进的地方。那这是它这个制度最突出的地方。好，那接下来呢，我们就欢迎我们第二个 speaker。Next, we welcome to our the second section. Our Dr. Hawk. Dr. Hawk is a specialist in anesthesia and come from Denmark. And he will tell us how about Denmark Patient Act. And Dr. Hawk, he had published many articles about how to use the patient registry system to reduce mortality and morbidity of some medical injury, like anesthesia or myocarditis. So let's give a big hand to Dr. Hawk.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to say thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be in Taiwan, and Chinese people seems to be very, very nice, so it's a little difficult to understand the big tension between the people and the doctors. But we hope our system in Denmark and Sweden might inspire you, because the tension between the people and the doctors in Denmark are much less than we hear is in Taiwan. Finally, I want to thank Dr. Yan. He has such an energy and consistent to try to change your system. It's impressive. I'd like to talk about the patient safety in Denmark. The system in Denmark and Sweden look similar, but there are some small differences, and you'll see that soon. First of all, Denmark has 5 million citizens. You have 23. So the number you see on my presentations, well, you have to multiply with 5 so you can compare. I'd like to start with one example. This happened 15 or 20 years ago in Denmark, and probably one of the worst cases we have had. It's about a 28-year-old pregnant woman. She was in labor, and everything seemed actually fine when she came to the hospital. But suddenly, at the hospital, the CTG showed signs of severe hypoxia of her child. It was decided to make an emergency cesarean, and the woman was brought to the operating theater, and she was anesthetized. The anesthesiologist was a resident in anesthesia, and in Denmark, when you are a resident, you have half a year at one hospital, then you change hospital, and you might be on call almost on the first day. So, and there are not the same equipment on each operating room. So it was her first day, or one of her first days, and she was not familiar with the technical equipment. But she got the woman anesthetized and intubated. Then she connected her to a ventilator in order to make her breathe. And then the first problem began, because the woman decelerated, she didn't get oxygen enough, and the ventilator gave alarm because the pressure was so high. They listened at her and got a little confused, but then they disconnected the tube, extubated her, they took the tube from her in her trachea up, and they back-valved the lady so that she had better oxygenation. Then they intubated her again, connected her to the ventilator, and the same problem arose. She called the attending physician in anesthesiology. He came to the operating theater very quickly. he saw there was quite severe problems, so he extubated her again, intubated her again, and connected to the ventilator. Exactly the same problem came, but now the woman had such bad oxygenation that she went into cardiac arrest. They attempted to rescue her, but she died, and unfortunately the baby died also. And a couple of months later, my husband committed suicide. So actually, this costed 3 people their lives. And what really happened? What was the actual problem? The woman was made an autopsy, showed that she had pneumothorax on both sides. And you see they used a quite old ventilator at that time, and the arrow at the top shows the tube where the woman exhaled, the woman exhaled through this tube. This is the correct connection of the tubes, but when the attending anesthesiologist came to the room, this tube where the arrow pointed was disconnected. So what did she do? She didn't put it on the correct place, but she put it on the iron piece you can see below in the picture, and it's a massive iron piece, so it's not possible at all to exhale through a massive iron piece, and that was the whole problem. So in the old days, this would go to the disciplinary act, and the resident in anesthesiology, she got a warning. She was so psychological consequent by the act that she decided not to be a physician anymore. A couple of years later, we made an analysis of these anesthesia events, and after that we did this system approach. So it's not only the individual, the system has its course also. They had trained her in the new ventilator she just started, so you can't expect anyone to know a ventilator you are not familiar with. So otherwise we put in a connection, so it's not possible to connect the tube to the iron piece, and furthermore the tubes were shortened so they couldn't reach the iron piece. And that was not only done in the one hospital where it happened, but every hospital in the whole country were advised about this incident. And it made us come to why errors actually happen. In the old days, it was just the individual, and the individual was the only one to blame, and there was no prevention in that system. But we must accept that we are actually working in a complex and partly unpredictable system. There are rules and routines, and these are not always sufficient. The organization is not at all always appropriate, and the education of healthcare persons is always not sufficient. That showed the example I showed you before. The education in the ventilator was not sufficient. And we must remember it is human to err. We are not robots. In the daily we have some obvious catastrophes, and they cause a lot of lives at once and draw great attention. In our system, in the hospital, the death, they are more hidden and sneaky, and you can wonder why patient safety has not drawn any attention besides from the last 10 or 15 years. This is from the hospital in Denmark. The new patient safety system, they don't talk about errors anymore. It's quite a forbidden word. They use adverse event. And you can think of an adverse event when something goes not as planned. there's a definition saying that it is something that happened or merely happened in connection with the treatment or care for the patient and has no relation to the patient's actual disease, and it caused injury, or it could have caused injury to the patient. And the definition of a serious adverse event. That's an adverse event that causes 7 days of extra hospitalization in average. How often, how frequent is this a problem? There has been several investigations, several studies, and where a study group has seen through records, and as you can see, the adverse events, and that's serious adverse events, the aggravation AE is about 10%. PRE stands for prevention, so about 35 to 50 of these adverse events would actually have been prevented. So if we do some patient safety culture, we might actually prevent a lot of these accidents and injuries from happening. What's the cost of adverse events? It's not cheap. We have 1.2 million admissions a year in Denmark, and as you saw before, there's 10% serious adverse events causing an average 7 days of extra hospitalization. That might be an infection after an operation, but it might be other adverse events as well. And so it costs about 120,000 multiplied by 7, multiplied by the cost per extra days of hospitalization. So that is $588 million. And if you multiply this with 5, you probably have the number in Taiwan. But do not forget there's a lot of human cost in these adverse events, both for the patient, but not forget for the physician as well. It has huge psychological consequences for a physician to do these adverse events. There are other costs when the patient can't work anymore, so the real cost is actually probably much higher than here. How do we in Denmark register accidents? We have anonymous registration of adverse events, that is adverse events reporting. And you can also use the old system if you want to do a disciplinary act against the healthcare person. And finally, we have the Patient Insurance Association, like Sweden. The adverse events, we had a health law in 2004. It was actually the first law in the world called health law. And it said that a personnel who becomes aware of an adverse event in connection with the patient's treatment or care, he must report this incident. But it's a kind of funny law because there's no consequence if he forgets to report it. But it's just saying that he must report it. It's very easy to report an adverse event. You just go to the homepage mentioned in the top, and it's very important that the reports cannot be used in any legal perspective at all. They are only to be used in prevention, in patient safety perspective. And just a little about the numbers. In 2004, when the law came, the healthcare person were obliged to report adverse events. We had 4,000 cases. In 2010, 35,000 cases. And now this year, until November, there is 70,000, and it's probably going to be 80,000 reports of adverse events. It's very important also to mention that from August this year, patients can report an adverse events as well. So it's not only the healthcare personnel, it's also patients. If they feel they have been suffering from adverse events, they can report it too. And when you go when you make the report, you write what happened, where did it happen, what was the consequence, and your opinion, how could it have been prevented? Well, these reports, what happened with them? They go to a patient safety coordinator at the department where the adverse event took place. Furthermore, they go to the direction of the department, and they go to a risk manager. There's only one risk manager at each hospital. And before going to the National Department of Patient Safety, all reports are anonymized. Many of them are anonymized in the first hand, but it's up to the reporters to decide whether they want to be anonymous or not. But before they go to the National Department of Patient Safety, every report is anonymized. And what's the handling of an adverse events report? Well, some is handling quite small injuries and not used to in prevention, so they are refused. Then some are accepted, then they are classified, they are scored in according to the severity, and they are analyzed, and finally there's a feedback. The feedback is only to the person if it's not anonymized, otherwise it could be feedback to the department. In the old punishing system, it was only the idea that it was individual responsibility. There's guilt, and it was often hidden because a healthcare person doing an adverse event will naturally try to hide such an event if it's going to be punished. We know that from studies. The individual responsibility was always it was punished with this system, and there was of course no common learning or prevention. Now we have an opening and learning system with no fear. You can be anonymous, and the no blame compensation system cannot be used in legal perspective also. The motto is, today it was you, but tomorrow it could be me. That is, it's not the individual, it's the system that has to be changed. So these adverse events are not happening. The organization must take errors into account and try to do what they can to prevent these. So patient safety is to minimize the risk of errors and focus on the organization and not the individual person. You can see it is a bit unclear, I know, but here we have 4 quite potent medicine used in acute settings, and they look similar. So in an acute stress situation, it is very easy to mix up these medicines. So is it the individual who is to blame, or is it the organization who has medicine that look totally equal? We think it's the last. So in our system, we found that this was a high risk of medicine error. So we forced the system to change these medicines so they have different color, different sizes. The reason why they had look alike is because it's cheaper to buy medicine in the same when it would be equal. But our results showed that these medicines were often confused, so they had to do something to change them, and they did. We have, as in Sweden, a patient insurance association, and it's again a no blame, also called no fault compensation system. It's just a matter of word. You can't be disciplinary punished in this system. And there's a law saying that a healthcare personnel is by law bound to inform a patient suffering from a serious complication that he has the possibility of compensation and he has to help filling the claim. But it's not that difficult to fill the claim. It's just a few lines. He cannot say that you are going to have compensation because it's not his decision, but there's the possibility. Again, it's very important to say that there's no legal action to healthcare personnel in this system, like in Sweden. The cases a claim is evaluated by a lawyer and the medical specialist relevant for the case. Anesthesia cases is evaluated by an anesthesiologist, and they use some experienced specialists to evaluate these cases. In Sweden, they talk about unavoidable injuries. We are not talking about unavoidable injuries, but we have 4 criteria to give compensation, and just one has to be fulfilled in order to get compensation. And actually, it's the 1 and 4 that are the most used. 2 and 3 are almost never used, but we have them. And 1 saying an experienced specialist would have acted differently, and thereby the injury would probably not have occurred. This is another word of saying that it is avoidable. You might say that. But it's an experienced specialist can make infection as well. So an infection, an experienced specialist is not perfect. Some of the injuries you could avoid it, but not all. And then there's the failure of the technical equipment, and there's alternative treatments to be considered more safe and offer the same benefits. So if you have 2 almost equal treatment regimes and you choose maybe the wrong one, but that's what you thought was correct, then you have the possibility of getting compensation. And finally, the 4th group, this is the group which is most often the reason for compensation. And it's saying that it's a rare injury. That means that it must not occur more than 2% of the cases. And now it has to be rare, and it has to be more extensive than what the patient would be expected to endure. So on the one hand, you have to have it to be rare, and on the other hand, you have to, the patient, how severe is his disease. If the patient is very, very severe, he has to tolerate more severe complication to the treatment. While a healthy person, he can get compensated for a minor complication. A patient with severe cancer or severe heart disease going for a heart surgery, he cannot be compensated when there is a small precision injury after the operation. But the completely healthy person going for appendicitis, for example, he gets compensated for a precision injury. So you have to compare these 2. And as in Sweden, we calculate the compensation, I think exactly the same way. The pain and suffering, reduced income, there's a maximum, so that the richest person in Denmark earning 1 billion, if he's injured at hospital, of course he won't get 1 billion, but there's a maximum of the reduced income. Reduced ability to work and medical expenses, and it's considered whether the injury would be expected to be permanent. And we have a graduation from 100% disability down to 5% disability. 5% is the lower limit because the compensation must exceed $2,000. We don't want to have a lot of small claims, so we have set a line of $2,000. That means that 2 injuries, well, they are not compensated, and a couple of days extra in the hospital, they are not compensated. Here's the numbers from the last 3 years, and you can see the rising. But we don't think it's because there's more injuries happen. Actually, we just think that people are becoming more aware of the system existing. And the Patient Insurance Association cover all aspects of the Danish healthcare system. It's not only a public hospital, it's a private hospital, it's everything. We have 36% of the claims that are compensated, and the compensation were in 2010 $130 million, a handling time of 220 days in average, and you have to compare this with the number that 2.4 million Danes they are treated annually at the public hospitals. We actually have a goal to reduce the number of injuries by 20% over the next 3 years. And how are we going to prevent any of these injuries? Well, we will use the cases where the patient received compensation because the treatment was not optimal, that is compensated after the criteria 1, an experienced specialist would have acted different. And in that way, you might discover some patterns in relation to inexpedient work procedures, maybe outdated clinical instructions in some hospitals, or the same that some hospitals might have incorrect treatment regimes. And this is still in the early stage. We have doing some patient safety research for the last 5 years, but now we have some results from our birth injuries, and we have changed the system to prevent these injuries, and other studies are coming, and we think that they're going to decrease the number of injuries. Because in the recent years in Denmark and probably other places, there's a major increase in activity. We have seen in Denmark a 19% increase over the last 3 years. And if we do not do any changes, the more treatment will lead to more injuries. So it's our opinion in Denmark that we actually have to improve patient safety, and this is by changing the system. That's the way to do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hoff's presentation. And 看起来走了一半。其实呢，Denmark 跟 Sweden 的 system 呢有一点点不同，但是其实他们的核心精神呢，同样都是有一个最重要的问题，就是说他们都承认犯错是人的天性。那医师既然是人，所以医生犯错这个也是很自然的事情。所以单纯去处罚医生呢，并不会造成整个病人的就是安全会提高。所以他们是希望说，经由就是让医师可以安心的。就是去医疗，然后他们也可以安心去承认自己的错误，那去检讨这些错误，才有办法提升病人的安全，这是他们最核心的精神。尽管说在 Sweden 他们的 compensation system， 他们的筛选的 criteria 其实是关于说，如果这个伤害是 avoidable 的时候，他们会 compensation。那在丹麦的话，他们用的 criteria 就有点不太一样。他们是用如果有经验的医师会做不同的决定，那会有不同的结果，或者是说很少见但是很严重的 side effect 出现的时候，他们会给予 compensation。但是他们同样基本的精神其实都是一样，他们都承认医师犯错这是一件很自然的事情，不要因为这样就直接去惩罚医生，这样对病人没有帮助，这是他们最核心的精神。那因为我们国家现在正在就是成立。开始在设立类似的医疗救济补偿制度啦，那所以我们会今天开这样子的研讨会，也是希望说能够学别人的长处，那真的能够用在我们的制度建立上面，那才有可能让我们的就是将来的医疗环境有可能会变得比较好，那大家工作起来会比较安心，不要说像现在是5大皆空嘛，就是内外妇儿疾还有重症都没有医师要走，主要是这样子才办这个研讨会。那各位手上有拿到一张结论，就是单张的结论。其实那个是我们昨天在台北花了1个下午，跟医界、法界、还有学者、还有消基会、医改会的人讨论出来的一个初步的共识。那这个是希望说真的可以用在我们卫生署，它在草创这个制度里面可以 可以真的用上去。那所以各位如果说听了今天的演讲，那有什么样子的就是建议或者对这个制度的希望的话，你们可以把这些意见就是传给我，那我会把它汇整起来，然后再就是之后再交给卫生署，那就是才有办法说让我们真的可以改变现在的制度，然后去改变我们的医疗环境。那因为我们的时间不多，所以 any question or comments to our speakers, Dr. Hope and Mr. Esperson? 那如果说没有的话，我们等一下在10点的时候还有另外一场会针对这个制度深入讨论的一个座谈会，那会在401从10点开始，就是新的门诊大楼401大会议室，那在做这个制度的深入讨论，那也欢迎大家参加，谢谢大家今天的参与。Thank you for your attention.
各位同仁，如果还用早餐，我们总还有哈。那医师如果需要法医学的医师法医学都要麻烦请先退一下。